Good evening, everyone. Hopefully, you're having a wonderful day so far. I've got a good one for you today. So, the Bank of Canada just increased their interest rates, and I've been seeing a lot of things going on the YouTubes about that. So, I decided to do a little bit of research on it, and I think CBC's Andrew Chang does a pretty good job of breaking it down. So before we get into this, please like and subscribe. That would be really awesome. If you liked the video, and with no further ado, let's get into it.
The Bank of Canada just made its first interest rate decision since a trade war with the US became a real possibility. They cut their overnight interest rate a 1/4 percentage point, which is great news for anyone borrowing money. But they also acknowledged that a storm may be coming.
We will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
Trump's promised tariffs have the potential to throw Canada's economy into a tailspin.
Tariff! In the case of a protracted, significant trade conflict, it would badly hurt economic activity in Canada.
There is still a ton of uncertainty here about how all of this will play out, but the Bank of Canada did lay out a worst-case scenario and what it might mean. Let's go through it. So what is the most severe scenario? Well, it's where Donald Trump goes full steam ahead and implements 25% tariffs across the board, as he said he'll do, and where Canada implements sweeping retaliatory tariffs in response, as they've suggested they might do. The first thing the Bank of Canada predicts is that this would cause a significant decline in the volume of exports from Canada to the US, which makes sense because
because what that'll do is that will try and force companies to pretty much make their stuff in their own country and then make the consumer pay for the stuff made in their own country. But it'll also bring up the prices because then you have to also say if it's made in Canada, you also have to pay made in Canada prices as well. Think about our dairy cartel we have here in Canada, right? Canada can't import any dairy from outside of its borders, so consumers have to pay the high price of Canadian milk. Then again, the issue with this is because of our price control, a lot of dairy producers throw out their milk to keep the prices at a steady rate. So, something like that.
Tariffs are just taxes paid for by the businesses doing the buying. So, if American companies suddenly have to pay more for the same Canadian stuff because there's a 25% tax on everything Canadian, they might just decide to buy less stuff to avoid the tariffs altogether.
What tariffs should do is decrease anybody's willingness to buy the more expensive product and make them come up with ways of finding something cheaper, something more efficient, something closer to home.
And if demand starts decreasing for Canadian exports, the value of those exports could drop too.
Usually when there's less demand for a product, the price of that product falls as well. And the Bank of Canada is saying that would happen here.
Whether you're exporting to the US or not is almost irrelevant. It's just merely the fact that you are producing more than what your domestic economy needs.
So you take those things together, lower demand for Canadian goods and lower prices for those goods. That's bad news for Canadian business. And you know what Canada exports an awful lot of? Oil.
If you take $10 off the price of oil, that's a couple $1 billion less of royalty revenue that the province is bringing in.
And here you start to see how every downside outcome causes another downside outcome, like dominoes falling one by one. Because the Bank of Canada writes that eventually that kind of hit to business would cause Canadian exporters to lower production and lay off workers. They've got to scale down if they're not making the same kind of money, right? There's no exact figure for how many jobs they think could be lost, but
we would probably expect the unemployment rate rises about a percentage point or so.
You're easily talking into the hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Doug Ford says as many as 500,000 jobs in Ontario alone. Just about every.
Now, what I'm hoping, since they're talking about the oil sector, and because I'm a little bit more knowledgeable about the oil sector, if this lays some people off, hopefully our government will get its act together and think about, maybe we are relying a little bit too much on the United States and we have to transport our oil out to different sectors. Let's start mass producing pipelines to all of our coasts. And so people can kind of move into the oil and gas sector, move into producing oil pipelines, and that way we can get more jobs to just kind of pump these things out as fast as possible. Though I'm just a guy who reads news on the internet, it'll at least take 2 to 3 years to even get that up and running, I think. And that's if everything goes without blockages in the government, blockages between provinces, blockages between, I don't know, radical environmental groups. You know the thing.
Everybody involved in this has a slightly different figure, but the short answer is an enormous number of Canadian jobs are exposed to this, are at risk as a result of it.
And it's not just job losses, because when you think about how Canada might retaliate, putting countervailing tariffs, taxes on American imports to Canada, I mean, just think of what American products you rely on any given day.
Things like fresh fruit and vegetables, which obviously it's winter in Canada. We import a lot of those from the United States.
There's also cars, machinery, drugs, chemicals, electronics. Those might all become more expensive too. For the same reason that US tariffs make things more expensive in the US, Canadian companies importing American things will have to pay Canadian tariffs to the Canadian government. And in many cases, some or all of those additional costs may eventually be passed on to Canadian consumers.
The reality is that the more of their stuff that we tariff, whether it's part of the supply chain or whether it's part of just being consumers, that we consume the products directly, we're going to start paying more money.
So, lost jobs, less purchasing power, which brings us to the Bank of Canada's next prediction. According to the Bank of Canada, all of these factors together could cause Canada's GDP to fall pretty significantly. They do acknowledge in their analysis that the government could mitigate this by taking some of that tariff money that they start charging and pumping it back into the economy, either to businesses or consumers themselves. But even still,
this would have a very material effect, would have a very severe effect on economic activity.
So how severe are we talking? Well, here's where we begin to understand how impossibly complex this question becomes. Because instead of giving just one definitive prediction in this case, the bank maps out multiple ways in which this one scenario could play out, depending on how quickly businesses pass on their extra costs to us, the consumers, and how everybody responds to this general idea of certain things becoming more expensive. But
oh, you can bet the oil and gas companies will pass it off to the consumers before these tariffs even come in. You're seeing in Alberta prices of over $150 per liter, or sorry, $1.50. Ugh, 150 would be rough, but yeah, $1.50 per liter. That's Vancouver levels. And we produce that stuff here.
At best case, they predict next year, Canada's GDP would be 2.2% lower than what it would have been otherwise. Worst case, 3% lower. To which, maybe you're like, 3%, that's not so bad. Except, it's bad enough to throw the country into a recession.
The economy is growing about 1.8% right now. In their assumption, if we get a 2.5 percentage point hit to growth, that's pretty consistent with normal recession in Canada.
I think the interesting thing here is it's effectively a permanent recession. There's no real way out of that drop in GDP. And I think that's where it starts to get really hard to really measure and get your head around what that actually feels like, what it looks like.
So here's one more question. If this worst case scenario does play out and this brand of tariff war forces Canada into a recession with no clear endpoint, how exactly might the bank respond?
Dude, okay, let's stop with this. Oh, if this happens, it'll throw us into a recession. We're already in a recession. We're pretty much, if we're not in a depression right now, we're borderlining into a depression because you're seeing 2 million new people at food banks. You're seeing food banks actually fail because they don't have enough food there. Our dollar is 70 cents of an American dollar and projected to go lower. I mean, if you don't call this heading into a depression, I don't know what is. If you look at the price of Bitcoin right now, it's skyrocketing, and this is an investment advice, but this is like what I view as something of a warning is people are throwing their money into that, I'm assuming just to keep their dollar at a certain amount rather than keeping it in Canadian and then it just gets devalued.
We're talking about interest rates, right? That's the lever the Bank of Canada has. But on this, the one real thing we turned to them for guidance on, they were actually pretty cryptic, opting not to give any real indication as to what it might do next.
There's a lot of uncertainty out there, and it just didn't seem very useful to provide guidance. And even when we do know more, we're going to have to do some more work to figure out exactly how that's going to play out through the economy.
But we've asked the question. We've all been through recessions before, so let's try to answer this question anyway.
Typically, the response you would see to that would be the Bank of Canada cutting interest rates when the economy weakens.
Right, because if you lower rates, you make it cheaper for Canadians to borrow money, which makes it more likely that they'll spend money, and that can help stimulate a struggling economy. But it's not so simple, because we're not just talking about a lagging economy. We're talking about higher prices at the same time.
Growth will be weaker, inflation will be higher.
Because that's the direct impact of tariffs. When things like fruits and vegetables get more expensive, that's inflation. The Bank of Canada's number one priority is inflation and keeping it in check. And it is predicting in this severe scenario, yes, inflation goes up. By how much? Again, depends on too many things to calculate ahead of time. And what happened most recently when inflation was a really big problem in this country? What did the Bank of Canada do? It raised interest rates aggressively to cool the economy and try to get prices under control. And it worked. So there's reason to think maybe they'll be forced to do that again, and we'll end up in a rate hiking cycle, which lands us now with the opposite solution that we had just outlined of cutting rates to give a lagging economy a kickstart.
So which one do? You can't step on the brake and the gas at the same time.
It becomes a really, volatile, interesting, and confusing mesh of countervailing forces all at play at once.
Now, we could get into the specific.
Now, what I think they're going to do is they're going to cut rates to try and initiate spending to try and keep our GDP from just crashing even more than it is right now. But if this tariff war actually goes on, and if it goes on for long enough, people are going to be going into more and more and more debt, just like they did before during COVID, and as they accumulate more, their interest will increase, and then when interest rates goes up, they'll have to pay more on that debt. And it's going to become too much, and then we were already projecting a lot of houses were going to default. Now, even more are going to default. And honestly, bad stuff's going to go down. It's going to be the Great Depression in Canada if this goes on long enough.
scientific reasons why one solution might be better than the other, and why there's reason to think that a rate hike is actually the least likely scenario.
So in a normal cycle, you would have a really strong economy, and that's driving inflation because there's so much demand out there. The difference in this environment is that that inflation is being kind of imposed by these tariffs and pushed through to producers and consumers at a time when growth is actually weakening.
But really, you can start to see why the Bank of Canada's governor today kind of just threw up his hands.
Monetary policy cannot offset the economic consequences of a protracted trade conflict. We can't lean against weaker growth and higher inflation at the same time. So, what are we going to be doing? Well, we're going to be assessing the relative weight of those two.
The bottom line being, this would be a pretty unprecedented spot for Canadians and the Bank of Canada to be in. And though the bank can do all it can to try to understand what Canadians can expect next, they've also made clear it's pretty much impossible to know for sure.
Well, especially when, you got a Donald Trump presidency, and that guy can do a lot and affect a lot. So it's kind of hard to come out really, really early and say, yes, we're going to do this. And then Donald Trump's like, yeah, I'm not going to put in tariffs. It's fine. But I really hope he doesn't. And we've done a lot with our border. Heck, Alberta has Blackhawks now patrolling the border, and they have those robotic dogs, and we just ramped up the amount of people patrolling. So, and we just need to get our military up to snuff, but we can't get to that 2% all in 1 year. That would be kind of financially irresponsible, but we can ramp it up a lot faster than we have right now by cutting a lot of waste. Anyways, but that's what I think is going to happen. What do you guys think is going to happen with all of these interest rates going down while the tariff talks are still on? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you don't mind hitting the subscribe button, I'd really appreciate that. I'm trying to hit the 1,000 mark by the end of this weekend. And also, cool thing is, I'll be in Japan for the coming month, so watch for those videos, because there'll be a lot of videos from Japan showing everything around. The video quality might go a little bit down just because I'm traveling, but the sites will probably make up for it. So anyways, other than that, that's all I got for you today, and have a great day.